Today was one of those days where you started to wonder how long will it be before the official position of the Trump administration will be that we need to change the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. It's the poem that is engraved on a bronze plaque inside the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, welcoming immigrants. It is arguably one of the most well-known poems in American history. Part of it reads, quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Those are words that have been cited by Americans for 100 years. From the time they're school children representing the American ideal. And yet that's a poem that's been the source of contention for the Trump administration as its policies become more and more antithetical to that idea. We first saw this in a bizarre press conference with Trump's senior advisor, Stephen Miller, 2 years ago.
The Statue of Liberty says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." It doesn't say anything about speaking English or being able to be a computer programmer. Aren't you trying to change what it means to be an immigrant coming into this country?
I don't want to get off into a whole thing about history here, but the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of liberty enlightening the world. It's a symbol of American liberty lighting the world. The poem that you're referring to that was added later is not actually part of the original Statue of Liberty. In 1970, when we let in 300,000 people a year, was that violating or not violating the Statue of Liberty law of the land? In the 1990s, when it was 500,000 a year, was it violating or not violating the Statue of Liberty law of the land? Tell me what years meet Jim Acosta's definition of the Statue of Liberty poem, law of the land.
2 years later, the poem still seems to be a source of trouble for the Trump administration.
Is that sentiment, "Give us your tired, your poor," still operative in the United States, or should those words come down? Should the plaque come down off the Statue of Liberty?
Well, I'm certainly not prepared to take anything down off the Statue of Liberty.
So that was the acting director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ken Cuccinelli, yesterday, not ready to answer for the policy that he was announcing, which would turn the screws on legal immigrants, being in direct contradiction with the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Well, today he went on National Public Radio and was clearly more prepared not to defend the policy, but to change the poem.
Would you also agree that Emma Lazarus's words etched on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, your poor," are also part of the American ethos?
They certainly are. Give me your tired and your poor who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge. That plaque was put on the Statue of Liberty at almost the same time as the first public charge law was passed. Very interesting timing.
Now, we're not sure who wrote that version of the poem for Ken Cuccinelli, but it sure seems Stephen Miller's version of American history is making its way around the White House. And the Stephen Miller vision for America sure is making its way into U.S. policy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.